Hello, I am Stephen Boniface. I'm a chartered building surveyor with over 43 years involvement in surveying and around 35 years dealing with historic building conservation. Today I'm here to talk to you about minimum intervention. This is one of the most important principles of building conservation. It is of course applicable in this instance to historic buildings, but can also be applied to any building. In my view, it is a very sustainable approach to dealing with buildings generally. When it comes to repairs and works to buildings, one way I like to refer to minimum intervention is to do as much as necessary, but as little as possible. Of course, this means that one has to understand the building and its problems before one can devise a suitable repair following this principle. Much of this talk is going to be looking at the approach to dealing with buildings and how to assess them for repairs, etc. Before going into great detail, let's look at some very basic and obvious examples. Examples looking at windows are perhaps the easiest to consider. I often see surveyor reports where they have identified some rot or damage to a window, and rather than recommend repair, have simply suggested that the window be replaced. Now, with modern buildings, that may be an appropriate approach, but of course with historic buildings that is inappropriate and isn't following the principle of minimum intervention. Here we see a bow bay window in a historic building. And you can see that most of the window is generally sound, but there are some problems along the sill area. Here are some closer views of that same window and another window in the same building. And here we can see that there is some rot and deterioration along the sills and bottom rails of the sash units. Although the sashes themselves required some overhaul, there were no major problems to the upper parts of the windows, and in fact with regard to the bay window, one can imagine how expensive it would be to try to replicate and replace such a unit. Therefore, it is fairly obvious that in this instance the windows only really need careful localized repair that are sensitively undertaken. Of course, it is not always easy to get to the timber to undertake that repair. In the previous slides, we saw original buildings in an historic building. And in that situation, it is pretty obvious that unless there were major failures and extensive rot and decay to the windows, then you would try to repair them rather than replace them. Especially bearing in mind that historic timbers, such as those, were probably better quality timbers than some of the replacement timbers we might use today. The problem with those windows was not poor quality timber leading to deterioration, but simply age and neglect of repainting on a regular basis. However, in the images in front of you now, these are modern windows in an extension to a historic building. Once again, they have been neglected and are deteriorating, particularly along the bottom rails and sills. In this instance, it would be a more difficult decision as to whether to simply replace the sills or replace the windows themselves. Therefore, I am not suggesting that following the principle of minimum intervention is always easy. Nonetheless, it should always be the starting point when looking at historic buildings. This final initial example is from a survey I undertook recently where the building is a listed building but where replacement windows had already been installed, and as you can see it was a double glazed unit, which was slightly unusual in itself. Nonetheless, in this particular instance the sill was quite badly rotted. Nonetheless, the rest of the window was generally sound, and it would not be too difficult to cut away the sill and add a new sill nosing to this particular window. Therefore, the principle of minimum intervention, even though it is a modern window, would still be applicable in this instance. So what I want to really focus on is the decision-making process. We need to start by looking at some of the high-level conservation principles, and here we have those principles as set out by Historic England. So first of all, the historic environment is a shared resource, and all should be able to participate in sustaining the historic environment. But understanding the significance of places is vital, and I'll come back to thinking about understanding buildings later. Decisions about change must be reasonable, transparent and consistent, and I would argue that those decisions must be justifiable. Also, we need to think about documenting and learning from decisions. This can be important because as we deal with repairs, we may uncover issues that were perhaps not at first obvious, and we can learn from those situations. And so now we look at conservation principles when it comes to repair. And I've set out the first one as understand the building. In my view, this is vital when dealing with any building, particularly historic buildings. We need to understand how the building has evolved, what the components of that building are, the materials that have been used, and how they have been brought together to create what we are standing in front of. We also need to understand how that building may have been altered, extended, etc. over the years to be able to begin to understand what may be happening to that building now and how to intervene and deal with works. The next principle I've set out is minimum intervention, as I have already mentioned at the outset of this talk. But we also need to think about past works. Over the years, the building might have been repaired on many occasions, and we need to think about those works and are they still effective and appropriate. We should have respect for past works and not simply assume that because they were undertaken many years ago that they have no value today. If a repair is still working perfectly satisfactorily, then there is no need to do anything. The next principle I've set out here is honesty in repair, and I put this because I come across many situations where people undertake a very good repair but then wish to disguise it to make it look old, and that is not necessarily honest. Sometimes we need to accept that a building has been repaired, and the repairs, whilst we don't want to have them sticking out like a sore thumb, on the other hand we don't want to disguise them in such a way that would be considered dishonest. The next is reversibility, and the fact that sometimes our present thinking may be limited, and therefore we need to undertake a repair or an intervention to a building that may in future be reversible if a different approach is considered appropriate in years to come. Then we need to have done something to the building that does not prevent it being repaired again at some future date. And then whilst we're repairing a building, we may come across evidence of something that existed in the past, perhaps an old window opening. But we should abstain from speculation and refrain from installing something that we think might have been there, but with no real evidence. So speculation is not usually appropriate for a historic building. Then, of course, we need to plan for future maintenance and management and think about how that building will be looked after in the future. And then finally, we need to ensure that whatever is undertaken is properly documented so that there is a record to pass on to future generations so that they're not left guessing as to what we have done. So far, I have been talking about the principles that we should adopt when dealing with repairs to historic buildings. But what this is leading to is the ability to justify the approach we are taking, the degree of intervention and the amount of repair that we consider necessary. To get to this point, we need to properly understand the building, as I have already mentioned. Once we have understood what is happening with that building and what defects exist and what repairs might be necessary, then we can consider the best method of repair and intervention that might be appropriate and can be justifiable. Nonetheless, we have to recognise that there will be pressures and demands on us as we make these decisions. There may be commercial requirements to consider, but of course there is always the issue of economic viability, and of course we need to think about continued use, because after all we're repairing this building so that it can continue in use into the future. The function of the building needs to be considered, and of course the function may be changing. There may be a change of use and a repurposing of the building in some way. This may also mean that we need to take a fairly flexible approach. Someone I studied under in the early 1990s was John Earle, and he puts it very succinctly. The conservation of historic structures is an extremely demanding discipline. Philosophy provides guiding lights, the practitioner must provide solutions. But of course we have to ask ourselves, what is a defect? Now the Cambridge Dictionary says a defect is a fault or a problem in something or someone that spoils that thing or person or causes it, him or her, not to work correctly. The implication here is that the defect stops something functioning. Some other definitions that I came across are listed below, and again these all imply that a defect means that something cannot be used as intended. However, when we deal with historic buildings, we will come across a number of defects that occurred many years ago and sometimes centuries ago that are not necessarily a problem now. It could be that past repair has rectified a defect or at least stopped it becoming worse. Or it could even be that the defect was the result of a one-off event that stopped soon after. It may mean that the building is distorted or exhibits something that is not perfect, but that does not necessarily mean that the building itself is defective. Whilst I do use the term defect in reports, I think it is a term that can be misused and seriously misunderstood. I always try to alert clients as to whether the defect is an active ongoing problem or whether it is something that occurred in the past and is no longer an issue for concern. But of course this is part of the assessment process, and our job as surveyors is to understand whether that defect does actually need any attention or not. Of course, when thinking about repairs, we have various options in terms of how we might advise a client. It is perfectly valid to simply advise that nothing needs to be done at the present and perhaps keep an eye on something. There is also the possibility that monitoring is necessary, and this might be a more active keeping an eye as such. It might be that there is a crack that you're not sure is active and needs to be monitored to see if it is active and ongoing, or whether it is static and does not need anything at the moment. And of course there might be some investigation. This could involve some opening up or exploratory works. There again, there could be some pretty obvious repairs necessary because you can see that something has clearly failed and there is a problem that needs intervention. And of course there are occasions where major intervention is necessary and very few occasions where demolition might be appropriate. Of course, demolition is a last resort. Some years ago, I came up with this very basic flowchart to help me to understand how to analyse a defect and understand what sort of interventions might be appropriate. And so here we have a property where there is a defect, and the first consideration is whether the building is fundamentally safe or unsafe. Now, if it is unsafe, one has to ask, is there imminent danger? And if the answer is yes, then we need to undertake emergency repair. And if it can be economically restored, then so be it. but if not, then demolition might be that last option and might be the route to follow. However, you will note that there are three possibilities for if the building is safe, if there is not imminent danger, or if it can be economically restored. And the first stage to follow after this assessment is to investigate the matter. This may mean some opening up or monitoring, but an assessment has to be made as to whether the damage is active or progressive in some way. If the answer is no, and it turns out that there is no active problem, then we have to ask ourselves whether it is actually necessary to restore integrity or robustness. Now, it might be that some gentle, sensitive intervention to give a little bit more help to a building is appropriate. This could be, for example, partnering up of some timbers under rafters in a roof space. And the works might be relatively light and non-invasive. But of course, you might find that the defect is an old matter that does not need any attention now, and it is simply a matter of making good and decorating. However, there will be situations where there is an active and progressive problem, and we then need to ask ourselves, can it be allowed to continue without causing unacceptable damage? Now, this is a more difficult matter to assess, but if the answer is yes, then it might be appropriate to simply monitor the situation to see what happens next, bearing in mind that quite often when we first see a building, it may be the first time we've come to that building, and we may have no record of past works or any proper understanding of what has gone before. And therefore we need to undertake that appraisal and assessment for ourselves that could involve simply monitoring the situation to see what is really happening. However, if it turns out that there is an active problem that needs attention, we need to then think about what is causing the problem. An example here might be trees and movement to buildings. We all know that in certain subsoils a tree can extract moisture and cause subsidence under a building, therefore causing some movement. And in those situations, if the tree were to be removed, would the soil recover and would the movement cease? If the answer is yes, then it may be that simply removing the cause, in that instance the tree, would deal with the problem, and the actual structural repair is far less invasive. But of course, if we are going to go down the route of removing the cause, then there will be a period of monitoring to see if that has been effective. Now, you will see from this flowchart that if that monitoring shows that there is still a problem, then we need to return to the question of, is there further work to be done to remove the cause and prevent that defect from continuing? But at some point there will be a decision made as to whether there is a need to undertake further repairs, arrest movements, or deal with that active problem with further intervention. And here we get back to the basic question of what is necessary to restore the integrity or robustness of the building. And of course, by now, having gone through this process, one would have understood the building far better and should be able to make that decision as to precisely what repairs would be appropriate. And it goes back to the phrase I used at the beginning, to do as much as is necessary to repair the building, but as little as possible to avoid going over the top and doing too much work that is actually unnecessary. And of course, at the end of this, there is the making good and decorate for the building generally. And what this flowchart doesn't show is the need to record and document every stage through this process and to log it so that future owners will understand what has been done so that they can understand the building better. And of course, if a problem were to arise in future, then they have a better understanding of what has gone before. We should always remember that everything deteriorates with age. We can't actually stop deterioration, but what we can do is manage that process of aging and ensure that the building deteriorates as slowly as possible. And it is by taking this approach that we protect these buildings and preserve them for future generations. So of course we then have to ask ourselves, what is safe? There will be situations where we see structures that do not appear to be safe and in actual fact are in a perhaps fragile or even precarious situation. But it depends on the context. Here we see a building just outside St Albans. It is a ruin of a building, and if one looks at elements of it in isolation, one can see a serious deterioration, evidence of movement, etc. But then we realise that this is simply a romantic ruin. It's not an occupied building, and at present it's not going to collapse on anyone. So here we don't have to worry too much about any loads that it's going to carry. We just need to be assured that it's simply not going to fall over. And the approach we might take with this could be very different from the same defects that we might see in an occupied building. And here is Finchingfield Guildhall, a building I looked at some years ago. And on the right of the main building, you can see an entrance, steps up to an entrance, and within that is a beam across the ceiling. And when I first looked at this, I noticed that a secondary beam had been placed underneath it. And this was because the main beam had cracked and had clearly suffered some degree of failure. But in this instance, the decision was made simply to put another timber underneath to provide that support. Now, if we look at the original structure and the fact that the beam is cracked, we would have to say that is unsafe. But of course, it has now been propped up and supported with a secondary beam underneath that shows no sign of distress or problem, and therefore the situation has been made safe. I mentioned a minute ago that with ruins, a slightly different approach needs to be considered, because obviously they're not occupied buildings. Here we have Hadley Castle on the banks of the River Thames near Southend, and the remains of a couple of towers. Now the tower on the left is in fact unstable, but initially when you look at it you don't realise this, and it is only following some monitoring that we began to realise that the ground was moving and the tower was gradually moving with it. Further investigation in this instance revealed that the problem was in fact foxes burrowing under the ground and destabilising the ground beneath this tower. On the face of it, it appeared to be safe in terms of the fact that it was a ruin and there were no obvious signs of a problem. But following a period of some monitoring, it was realised it was not as safe as at first it appeared. And this illustrates the fact that sometimes we do have to take care and think very carefully about what is happening to that building and what we might have to do. Therefore, this whole issue of monitoring is perhaps the most important thing that we should consider. In fact, I find myself more frequently now saying to clients to monitor a situation rather than simply intervene. Here we see a crown post roof. On the left is a photograph I took about 20 years ago when I surveyed the property for a potential purchaser, and you can see the past repairs, but the building was basically stable. Nonetheless, over the years, the clients decided to re-roof the building, and in so doing, they discovered that the roof wasn't as strong as perhaps it at first appeared. And earlier this year, I was asked to survey because my original clients were selling it again, and I was fortunate enough to be able to go back to the building, and I was able to see what sort of repairs they had then undertaken. And in the right, you can see that some steel work and additional timbers have been installed, and this was undertaken only a few years ago, but it was just sufficient to give the roof that little bit of extra help. So now we're going to look at some examples where we need to think about how to assess for those repairs and what might be needed. And so here we see a typical Georgian terraced building, and in this instance there was an outbreak of dry rot just inside the building, and in fact to the left hand side of this photo as you see it, and as you can see that is in line with the downpipe that runs to the outside of the building. And when you look at this you can see some staining behind it, and in fact there was some leakage from this downpipe. But of course it is necessary to understand how these buildings are put together to understand why there might be a dry rot outbreak. And the simple fact is that although the building is brickwork on the face of it, there is a lot of timber behind that facade and within the structure to the roof, the floors, lintels, panelling, etc. Therefore, a relatively small amount of dampness getting in through a leak from the outlet at the top and or the downpipe could cause a lot of damage internally. This is where understanding the nature and construction of the building goes a long way to help assessing what might be necessary. Sometimes the problem is one to do with perhaps maintenance. Here is a lovely Georgian building again, and you can see that it's got a very deep cornice at the perimeter of the roof, and at either side of the central pedimented area there are downpipes. Now just to the right of each of these downpipes, if you look very carefully, there are some dark stains under the cornice, and these were areas where rot had occurred to both sections. Now upon further investigation, and in fact this involved looking out the dormer windows at the top, it was pretty obvious that the outlets for the downpipes had become blocked, and because of this water was backing up and through into the cornice that happened to be timber, and therefore it was causing rot and deterioration. So in this instance the problem was simply because someone hadn't taken the trouble to periodically check those outlets and keep them clear. Maintenance is a big issue when it comes to historic buildings, and it is important that clients understand that maintenance of a building will go a long way in preventing long-term problems. Sometimes we find that works undertaken in the past thought to be well-meaning are now causing problems. Here a tiled roof has been turnerized. That is where a Hessian sheet is put over with bitumen to try to provide some sort of covering to the roof to help prevent it deteriorating further. But in this instance it has simply caused trapping of moisture and further deterioration, and in fact in this instance the rafters under this area were rotting and the whole roof had to be stripped with quite major repair being undertaken. Now on the face of it that doesn't appear to be a major issue at present, and you can't see any major splits or problems, but if you understand what it is actually doing underneath that area, you can begin to understand what might be happening to the structure below. And in this instance I was able to advise my client who purchased the property that they should allow for quite a major cost in dealing with this roof. And in fact I saw them a couple of years after this, and they found that the roof did in fact need complete stripping and recovering, and a number of the rafters had indeed failed. And here is another building where a concealed problem was not immediately apparent. Now in this instance the valleys around the roof, the parapet, gutters, etc. were in need of complete stripping out and relining. There were signs of quite significant leakage in places, and we knew that some of the rafter feet were rotting. However, once the scaffolding was up and we started to unpick the structure, we realised that the wall plate at the feet of the rafters extended far further into that parapet wall than we had anticipated, and as a result the whole parapet had to be completely taken down and rebuilt. It was not possible to try to do the work with the parapet still in place. What this teaches is that sometimes not everything we see on the surface is as it seems, And with old buildings, there are a variety of things that could have been done over the years. And this was the first time I had come across a situation where the wall plate wasn't simply sitting on a ledge in the brickwork, but actually extended into the brickwork, and therefore when it rotted caused a more significant problem. Here we have a centre valley that is lead lined, and on the face of it, it doesn't appear to be too bad. But in this instance, there was sufficient debris to cause blockage, and when it rained heavily, water backed up and straight into those joints. And because of this, the area below this was suffering from rot. Now in this instance, you can see that there are a number of slopes around this area, and in fact, these slopes are concealed from ground level. And one of the things I sometimes advise clients when it comes to these sort of valleys is to think about putting some access hatches into one of the concealed slopes, simply to ensure that it is far easier to maintain these valleys. If it is easy to look at and maintain, then it is less likely to become problematic. In this particular instance, there was a crack above the window and evidence of movement. Now, I had surveyed this property some years before, and I had evidence that when I surveyed it, there was no crack. So we knew the crack was recent and it was an ongoing matter. An insurance claim was submitted, and we eventually found that it was due to some trees nearby. Those trees were then removed following the advice of a tree surgeon, and the property was monitored for a period and found that it restored itself without the need for underpinning or further major work. This was a property in Kent that I was called in some years ago to advise with regard to dampness. Now you can see that the upper part of this is timber frame, but the lower section is brickwork. Now the reason for this is that the property sits quite close to a river and gets regularly flooded, and over the years the frame had deteriorated and been replaced with brickwork. But in more recent times, the insurance company had insisted that following a flood that they should in fact tank the whole of the ground floor. What then happened was the brickwork had started to deteriorate and they were experiencing quite serious damp problems internally. Now the situation here was that they'd quite simply created a swimming pool of the ground floor, and so therefore whenever a flood occurred or whenever there was heavy water, it couldn't escape. And in fact the works that had been undertaken were making the problem worse rather than resolving it. So in this instance we decided that whilst there was nothing we could do to necessarily stop the periodic flooding, there was a possibility we could alleviate some of the damage by ensuring that that moisture could escape quickly rather than becoming trapped. Now here we have an example from Cambridge, and what looks to be a rendered building on some sort of structure. But of course we have to ask ourselves, what is that structure? Is it brickwork? Is it timber frame? Or what is it? Well, in this instance, this region has a number of buildings built of earth or clay lump. And that is in fact what this building was constructed from, and it could be seen in one of the cupboards and in the roof space. But one of the problems with earth buildings like this is that if they are finished with impermeable finishes, there is a significant increase in the chance that moisture will become trapped. And if this happens, then the earth can lose its integrity. And I have seen on one or two occasions where such structures can collapse quite dramatically and quite rapidly. It is therefore important to understand the nature of the building and whether that finish is likely to be more of a problem for this type of structure than perhaps if it had been on top of a brick building. So in this instance, it was decided that the best thing for the building was to completely strip the paint, render, etc., and to revert to lime render and lime wash. Fortunately, as the work took place, it was found that the earth wasn't too bad. Here we have a building with a significant damp problem to the flank wall, and when we look at the flank we see what seemed to be the remains of chimneys, and in fact that's exactly what they were. I discovered that some bombing during the Second World War had obliterated some of the nearby buildings, and the neighbouring property was demolished and left like this. And because of it, there were these chimneys with the shoulders and the parapet, and this had all been rendered. But of course this was never intended to be an exposed elevation, and over the years it had suffered water ingress. But again, this illustrates the need to understand the history of the building to understand why the problem is occurring. Here again we have on the left a picture I took nearly 20 years ago of a timber frame building, and in this instance there was a cement render. When it rained, the water ran straight down the cement and into the timber, and it was causing quite significant rot. So my recommendation was that the cement render would have to be replaced, the frame repaired, and then once repaired, a lime render and lime wash reinstated. Last year, my previous client was selling the property and I was invited to do the survey for the next purchaser. And on the right, you can see the repaired building that had been repaired some years ago. And in this instance, the lime wash is doing its job. There was no problem with the frame. And in fact, it had been carefully and sensitively repaired. Unfortunately, though, it had been found that as the work took place, the frame was in worse condition than had been anticipated, and more of it had to be repaired. And here we have another timber frame building that I looked at some years ago, in this instance with a jetty. And as you can see, in this particular instance, the frame has been completely exposed, with the cement render having been completely removed, together with the infill, because in this instance there was a brick infill and one couldn't get to the frame without removing the infill. But once that had been taken away, we could see the amount of deterioration that had occurred to the jetty beam. The question here was quite how much repair to be undertaken and in what manner. Going back to the principle of minimum intervention, one tries to avoid the need to completely replace timbers, and in this instance we devised a way of strengthening the timber by adding to it and providing some metal brackets, etc., to strengthen the joints where necessary. But it did mean that we were able to leave as much of the original timber in place as possible, and this is often the aim of repairs to buildings like this. As I come towards the end of my talk, I'm going to take us through a case study. Now, this is a situation that started as one thing and ended up being something very different. So here we see a pub. It's in the Fens of Cambridgeshire, and I was called in to look at a basic damp problem. The tenants of the pub had complained for some time that their bedroom behind this end gable constantly suffered a damp problem, and they wanted it resolved. And of course the pub had undertaken various works over a period of time in an attempt to deal with it, and in fact they just made matters worse. And here you can see the situation before I got involved in any depth. This was from my first inspection, and you can see that it's a brick gable end. It had been repaired with a new parapet and cement fillet where the thatch joined. But this front elevation below here is timber frame. So it's a timber frame building with a gable end. And I suspect that the reason this end gable was brickwork was because it had always suffered a problem of damp. And this gable facing south was deliberately built to provide some protection for the rest of the building. Unfortunately, what had happened over the years was that moisture had got into the areas behind and become trapped. So the attempts to stop water ingress had failed, but because of the nature of the work they'd undertaken, once water had got behind these surfaces, it was then trapped and causing no end of trouble for the building. Now this is the bedroom inside and behind that gable, and here you can see the frame of the roof coming down to a wall plate. And as soon as I stepped into this area, I realised there was something wrong and something was happening. And I noticed that there were some cracks along the top of the wall plate. And in fact, whilst you can't see it in the photographs here, there was active death watch beetle. I quickly realised that the problem was far more significant than just simply a bit of damp in the end gable. And I said that I thought that the dampness had got to the point of causing some major problems for the timber frame, and there were in fact signs of an active issue in terms of movement and beetle infestation, and indeed in the bar below this there were other signs of recent cracking. My advice was to undertake some careful investigation to see what was really going on at the front corner of the building. And so I asked them to take off the render so that we could see what was happening at the corner. And on the first day I returned to the property, they'd only taken about ½ a metre back from the corner. And I asked them why hadn't they gone a bit further? And the answer from the contractors was quite simply, well, the building's moving, isn't it? And they had discovered that as they took the render off, there was clearly active movement to the building. So the very next thing we had to do was prop the building. And you can see in the right hand photograph some propping. What we actually undertook was some external raking props, and internally we created a completely false timber frame to completely hold up the whole of the structure from the inside. Whilst I was looking at these timbers, I noticed active death watch beetle and quite serious deterioration. In fact, in the right hand photograph, the left hand timber was examined in detail, and this photograph was taken just before it was looked at, and when the contractor went up to see how much of that timber had deteriorated, it literally came away in his hand. We quickly realised that the frame was in dire condition and needed quite major intervention. And in fact, here you can see in the right hand section of this photograph where parts of the frame had been replaced already. But in the process of carrying out this work, in front of the chimney to this building, we discovered an old bread oven. And in fact, this was a very rare example of a community bread oven that was accessible from the outside of the building. Therefore, it was important that we recorded this in photographs and drawings before we then covered it up. And of course, we had to take great care not to cause unnecessary damage or disturbance to this, whilst trying to repair and provide some integrity for the building. As we worked along the building, we found that whilst there were sections of brickwork, any timber frame we came across was severely deteriorated and was no longer capable of performing properly, and as it has lost basically all of its integrity. At one point I had the conservation officer on site and we were discussing the repairs, and I was asked why couldn't we simply repair the frame in situ, and I pointed out that to undertake a repair you had to have something sound to repair to, but in this instance there was nothing sound left with regard to the frame, and therefore we had to completely rebuild the frame. In this instance it happened to be a Grade 2 star listed building, and therefore we had to consider it very carefully. But we had clear evidence of what the frame was before, and it was therefore copied in new oak. And here we can see that frame being built in the yard of the pub. So the work was undertaken on site, so the measurements and the construction of it could be very accurately created. And it was possible to then offer the frame up and adjust it on site. This is a photograph as we near completion. Now the frame along the front has been completely rebuilt and rendered with lime render. We took the opportunity to incorporate some permeable insulation so that it was upgraded to a degree, and that was all accepted by the authorities. To the end gable we provided a lime render finish and lime wash finish, but I installed a Pentis board at higher level to help shed some of the water from the upper gable. You'll also notice that rather than completely dismantle the parapet, we decided to cap it with lead and provide a detail that would hopefully ensure that water wasn't going to be directed into the building in future. And here we see a more recent image of the pub, and as you can see, it is now generally restored and looking in good healthy condition. By the way, there were other works to the framework you could see on the left, but I wanted to focus on the replacement of the frame in this particular talk. So there we have it, my talk on minimum intervention. But as I close, I just want to recap on some of the issues touched upon. And I would say that the first principle, and in my view the most important, is that it is vital that you understand the building before you start doing anything to it. This involves understanding the materials used, both in past works and perhaps in more recent works, the methods of construction, and bear in mind that some of those methods might be concealed within the building and may not be fully understood until you open up. You need to understand the evolution of construction, how it has been altered over the years. Think about the past works and what has already been done, and are they effective? What alterations have been carried out that might affect the performance of the building, and of course the performance of it generally, both holistically and elementally. These are all important factors in understanding the building. Over the years, I have come across a number of issues that I would say are perhaps the more typical problems. Perhaps the number one is the use of impermeable finishes and materials. This leads to trapped moisture, and I would say these are perhaps the most common problems I come across. But of course there are the concealed structural elements that can catch you out, and you always need to bear in mind that what you're looking at might not be the whole story. The matter of concealed timbers and how they might be impacted by damp or infestation. And of course there will be unusual materials, sometimes experimental, because we need to remember that the Georgian and Victorian periods in particular were eras when there was significant change in materials, a lot of experimentation through the Industrial Revolution and the period of science, etc., etc. So we need to bear that in mind. And we also have to accept that these sort of buildings, older buildings, have higher normal levels of moisture than we might be prepared to accept in a modern building. This means that there is an increased possibility of damp problems, infestation and rot. And we need to bear that in mind. And of course there will always be the issue of past damage caused by this. There will also be some historic settlement and movement to buildings. Very few historic buildings get away with having no evidence of any movement. And then we need to think about poor detailing. I remember a story once about the Brighton Pavilion and the fact that it suffered quite a major rot problem. And when they looked at it and rectified it, they realised that when Nash had designed it, he had actually designed the rainwater disposal quite poorly, and it directed water into the building, and this was part of the problem. And therefore they had to change the detailing to improve the situation. And so sometimes we do have to think about what was done originally, and is that necessarily the best thing for the building, or is there some careful, sensitive change we can make that will improve the building? So when we're thinking about remedial works, this is a list of the sort of things I think need to be considered. Identify the cause or cause of the problem, movement, dampness, rot, infestation, etc. And where possible and appropriate, remove those causes. Ensure that there is a suitable maintenance regime to avoid future problems, and this can involve adjusting lifestyle of the occupants if necessary. Amending the detailing of the building if that is found to be problematic, and of course change or upgrade materials if necessary and appropriate. Targeted treatment might be necessary. Isolate vulnerable materials, especially if they are in contact with dampness, etc. Provide additional support. It's not always necessary to do something too clever. Sometimes a piece of timber to prop up or support is all that's really necessary. So we need to ascertain the true extent of the damage and just look into it in more detail rather than accepting on face value immediately everything we see. I would argue that the most important characteristic of a good conservation surveyor is someone who always asks questions, and that helps to understand the problems and avoid some of the issues that can arise. So what are the typical problems I find when dealing with works to buildings undertaken by others? Well, one is ignorance, quite simply blundering into a situation without properly understanding it and not bothering to learn what is happening with that building or with regard to those particular materials. There's often a desire for quick fix solutions, over-reliance on chemicals, for example, lack of adequate defect analysis and an inadequate understanding of building pathology, solutions, etc., poor identification of problems, and then a lack of detailed schedule of works or instruction to the builder. The number of times I see reliance on the builder to resolve the problems, and that's not good enough. And then no checking to ensure that the work has been completed satisfactorily. And then finally, no adequate maintenance regime thereafter. And so here are some final thoughts. So building conservation is for all surveyors, and whilst there are specialist elements, it should be a core topic at its heart. It's not an exact science. There is no hard and fast formula that will always deal with a problem that you come across. There is one golden rule. There are no rules. Every problem is an individual problem, and each situation should be considered with this in mind. And of course, it is as much to do with the attitude and approach that you take to it as anything to do with the age of the building, its construction, etc. The materials, the use of materials, techniques, etc. can be learnt, but it is the attitude that is important. Understanding the building is essential, but I would say that that's essential with any building. And of course, there should be a justifiable approach based on sound principles, and this should be at the back of mind of all surveyors when dealing with any building. A building professional with no knowledge of conservation is like an artist trying to paint without a full palette of colours, in my opinion. And so there you have it. That's the end of my talk. I hope you find this helpful and stimulating, but I now look forward to taking any questions.